Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar with Mixmode and 5Q Cyber. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to give it just a couple minutes here, maybe till about 11:02, 11:03, just to make sure everyone has a chance to join us. Again, thanks for joining us today. We're really excited to get kicked off here. I think we're going to have an exciting discussion today. And yeah, if you could just hang around, and we'll be getting kicked off here in just a couple minutes. So
great. Thanks, Christian.
Yep, no problem. Hope everyone's having a good Wednesday. Just while we're waiting here too, everyone that's on the webinar as a participant, you'll probably see a little dashboard to the right or of your screen or somewhere on your screen that allows you to chat in. We'll be monitoring the chat intermittently, and there's also an option to ask questions here. This webinar is going to be a panel-style discussion webinar between the two members here with me, Jeff Coulihan and Don Goldstein, who you'll meet in a moment. You can use that question tab and ask questions at any time during the webinar, but we're not going to be answering any Q&A until the end. We will have a session for Q&A at the end of the webinar. So feel free to use that, and we'll get to your question at the end of the webinar during the Q&A session. So hope you guys enjoy, and we'll just wait about one more minute and we'll get kicked off here. And oh yeah, I'll mention actually one more thing. At any time, if you have to leave the webinar or something, we will make this available via on demand as well, so you can watch it. But live, what goes on live is always better. So if you can hang around, that would be great. All right. Well, you know what? I think we've hung around for a little bit. Webinar was supposed to start at 11. We wanted to wait a couple extra minutes to allow people to join. And so why don't we just really quickly, I'm going to go over an agenda and then I'll kick it off so we can meet our webinar participants here. My name is Christian Weens. I'm the head of marketing at Mixmode, and I'm going to be just kind of your panel moderator today. The agenda that we're going to be discussing. We're going to go through kind of the current state of the Security Operations Center and specifically some of the limitations that some of the tools like SIEM and the failed promises of those tools some of those implications have brought around. We'll then kind of be reviewing how other new tools like network traffic analysis and network detection and response tools fit into the equation, and the convergence of those with the traditional SIEM system. And then finally, we're going to talk about the arrival of some new security solutions with an AI-first approach and what that means for the next generation of security operations centers. So that's sort of the agenda that we're going to be going through today. We might veer off a little bit. It's a panel-style discussion, so you never know where we're going to go. But I think it's going to be very interesting and very informative. And with that, why don't we meet our participants today? Like I said, my name is Christian Weens. I'm the director of marketing at Mixmode, and I'm going to pass it over to Jeff and then Don to introduce themselves.
Thank you so much for having us today, Christian. We really appreciate it and looking forward to the discussion. As Christian mentioned, my name is Jeff Coulihan. I run sales and alliances for Mixmode, and I've spent the bulk of my career focusing on a combination of advanced analytics and cybersecurity platforms. Very happy to be here.
Thanks, Jeff.
Hey, everybody. My name is Don Goldstein. Thanks, Christian and Mixmode, for having me on the webinar. I'm very excited to be here and talk about this timely topic. I am CEO of 5Q Cyber. We've been in existence for about a year and a half now. Prior to that, in my 30+ years in IT, I served in a variety of roles, including as a global CIO and global Chief Information Security Officer for the world's largest commercial real estate services company. 5Q Cyber is a managed security services provider focused on the real estate industry. I've also been serving as an advisor to Mixmode for the past couple of years, which I'm very excited about, working with John Keister and his team. So Delighted to be here with you, Jeff and Christian, and have this discussion.
All right. Thank you so much, Don and Jeff. Well, one thing I forgot to mention is the webinar will be about 45 minutes to an hour. Like I said, we'll have Q&A at the end, so we don't know exactly how long it's going to go. But I just wanted to let you guys all know that. And why don't we just kind of jump right into it and kick it off here. I wanted to start out with this quote here that we recently got from an analyst over at IDC. And through this quote and through some of the experiences that we've had, we found that and it's talking to analysts and other customers and people that are really in the thick of what's going on in security today. We found that there's a fundamental flaw with kind of some of the security operations centers of today. Cybersecurity spend is higher than ever, but despite that, attacks are going up and organizations kind of remain vulnerable to attacks. And one of the major reasons for that is the problems that these SOCs face with their legacy SIEM deployments. I guess what I'm trying to say is more spend on cybersecurity doesn't necessarily mean more actual security. And as you can see from this quote, which I'll just read here in a minute, a lot of these problems in limitations with traditional SIEM stem from bad data or false positives. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I'm going to go ahead and read the quote, and then maybe we can just kick off a quick discussion about this to start. Ritu Jyoti is the VP. She's the VP AI analyst over at the IDC analyst firm. And she recently stated that billions of dollars are spent on products like SIEM that do not operate efficiently because they are ingesting too much data and delivering an overwhelming number of false positives, garbage in and garbage out. Now, Jeff, I want to just hand this over to you to discuss some of these limitations people are seeing and some of the problems pointed out, like this one in the quote Ritu had so graciously provided us.
Sure. Thank you, Christian. So I agree in part with this statement, and in particular, this idea that most of our customers and prospects and the folks that we speak with in the industry are in fact inundated with false positives, number one, which I think is an important business challenge to acknowledge. The second business challenge that I think this does a really nice job of highlighting is it's extremely difficult to determine what data sources to include and how much data to include in your SIEM platform. And what our customers and prospects will tell us is that the complexity and cost associated with this approach to cybersecurity is more a function of the legacy technology upon which these platforms are built rather than the data itself. And what I mean by that is these platforms were based initially as search and investigation tools for aggregations of log data. The fundamental business purpose was to be able to search and investigate for specific information against unstructured data formats. And that's been modified over time to try and accommodate security types of use cases, including extraction and transformation and normalization of the data time and time again. And what you end up with as a result is inherent latency that's built into the system, and this compounded problem that our customers face of trying to determine which data sources are relevant to include, which data sources could I theoretically exclude, and what is the security impact going to look like by making that choice to either include or exclude information that may or may not have relevance. So I do think it's it's indicative of a very important and poignant business challenge that folks in the industry are tasked with addressing today, which is how do I determine an effective means to reduce false positives and focus on the true threats and anomalies that have an impact on my environment? How do I maximize my investment in legacy platforms so I simply don't throw those things away? And also, how am I mindful of costs and resource involvement to accommodate both legacy platforms like the traditional approach to SIEM, as well as emerging approaches to security and threat and anomaly identification? And Don, with your experience, I would love to hear your perspective on the accuracy or potentially challenge those statements that I've made, and we can hopefully use that to kick off a very candid conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I guess the part of this quote I'd focus on, since you really explained the first part of it, is really the last four words, right? So we've heard this garbage in, garbage out for a long, long time. I've been around probably much too long, because this was the phrase used 30 years ago, in terms of data entry. So now we're talking about it in terms of security events and incidents. And what I think is important for this is there is so much data. Not that the data itself is garbage, because it in and of itself is useful information to capture. The question is, what is meaningful, actionable data within all the other data that's there, right? And getting to it quickly, and doing it with a minimal amount of resources, and having it be more real time. Right. So I know we're going to get into a lot of these things, and the challenges of the current SIMs and what we're looking for in the next generation SIMs. But I can tell you, with the sprawl of services and products in the security space, of which this is just one, it's perhaps the most challenging of all of them, because of what it's intended to do and how it operates inside organizations. And I also have to say that every organization of a large size and scope has a SIM of some kind, or maybe more than one. But a lot of medium to small organizations don't have one at all. So so how do the medium and smaller organizations, which need a SIM, afford one, right? That can be useful to them, because a lot of these current SIMs are beyond their capability to invest in, deploy, and support.
That was great, Don and Jeff. And, one of the things, this might be, something that we just talked about, but Ponemon actually recently did a research report on, and one of the questions and sections of the whole report was about actual cybersecurity challenges and the people that run the cybersecurity organizations with the enterprises, their challenges with SIM technologies. And, top one I can see is certain SIM generated tasks need to be automated, allowing time to focus on priorities, and less visibility is the second one. They don't have great enough visibility. Is there anything else that you guys can think of, or common issues that you see with some of the legacy SIM technologies that you would like to speak to? Maybe we could start with you, Jeff.
Sure. Yeah, I find this research particularly interesting because it demonstrates that there's this organic convergence of the requirement to consider log and aggregate data as well as real-time network traffic information. It's simply just the nature of the beast that customers are demanding. And one of the things that I found most interesting in all my time working with SIM and log management correlative analysis platforms was there was typically candid acknowledgement that network traffic data is the most comprehensive source of data for real-time threat detection and anomaly detection. Somewhat ironically, it's typically the first data source to be excluded from a traditional SIM deployment because the volumes are so large. When you look at the volume requirements that would be additive to a traditional SIM deployment by the inclusion of real-time network traffic data, customers will tell me that it's an average of 3 to 5x the initial volume estimates that they're looking to deploy, or perhaps more specifically, fall within their budgetary constraints. So what you've seen as a direct result is the creation of silos of not only data, but also silos of solutions that are designed to address that data. And foundational to this conversation, the original silo was created specifically for machine-generated data, log type of data that could be stored and consolidated and normalized for search and investigative purposes. And then the analyst community also created then a secondary category for network traffic analysis, or XDR or NDR, depending on the nomenclature that the analyst chooses, as what they historically referred to as a supplemental category to a SIM deployment. And I think what you're seeing from the research and from analyst feedback and customer feedback and deployment expertise is that the organic convergence of these requirements is really driven by the functional needs of the customers that are deploying them. And as a result, you're seeing a real trend in the industry that's driving the convergence of legacy historic data, real-time network traffic data, and last but certainly not least, the inclusion of artificial intelligence to support and augment some of these requirements to continually manage those data sources as reflected in the report. Don, any comments or your thoughts in the industry?
Yeah, I think the next slide, Christian, if you go to that, will kind of give us the context for what we're facing in terms of the SIM limitations and the challenges and why we are where we are today with the SIM platforms. I would say a couple things on this. First of all, when SIMs first were developed, they were largely developed to ingest on-premises data, right? And as we know, that world has changed dramatically because data can be anywhere and is largely not on-prem in most cases now. This compliance-driven requirement that audit wanted logs so they could go back and find out who accessed what when. That's a lot of what originally happened with SIMs. But then you get an overload of data. Those logs become huge. Many companies are experiencing 1 billion incidents or events a day, right? And then logging all of that data, having to keep it somewhere. Then you have the timeliness of reporting this data. And then you just have to figure out, okay, what do I act on from all the information I'm getting? And now with the privacy issues, these SIMs have to comply with those new regulations that have come into play. Traditionally, SIMs were not built to incorporate third-party threat data. And we know if you're missing that, there are unknown IP addresses that remain unknown because there's nothing in your SIM to tell you what it is and where it's from. When you ingest a third-party intel, now you're able to better identify those kinds of rogue IPs, let's say. The other thing is that SIMs traditionally focused on external threats. So when we get to the discussion about network analysis, right, it's more what's coming into your organization or what's going out, but not as much of the east-west traffic within your organization, right? The other thing I'd say is, and this is related to what I said before about the fact that it was built mostly for on-prem, is the attack surface is so broad now in many organizations that you have to bring that data in and do something with it, or you're blind to a lot of events. A business email compromise attack is not going to be detected by your SIM, right? And you also have most organizations with a separate network operations center than a security operations center. They don't, although they oftentimes work together, they're looking for different things. And how do you best leverage this kind of technology so that they're used across the organization in both groups, the SOC and the NOC? Those are kind of some of the things that I would say, in addition to the fact that often they're costly, they're resource intensive, and as we know, there's a shortage of talent in this industry. So you have to either develop or hire people or bring outside parties in, and then there's just the time to deploy these tools and change. If you make a change in your SIM, the time it takes to deploy a new tool in your organization. So, and we have to look at what people are spending their time in when they're looking at their SIM data. Are they spending time looking for actionable events, or are they spending time dealing with actionable events? That's really what is going to make a SIM valuable to an organization.
I love those points, Don. And if I may just add to that, to bring it full circle, Christian, to one of the slides that you brought up earlier, is this idea of the data management aspect of a traditional SIEM deployment and the associated costs. I think it's important to note that customers are challenged not only with ever increasing ingest requirements for legacy SIEM deployments, but they're also challenged by data retention requirements. So they're not only required to ingest more and more for fear that, I may miss something that I need to go back and search and investigate later for, audit purposes or compliance purposes. But there are very specific compliance requirements when you're dealing with HIPAA and PCI and other data storage requirements that these SIEM vendors have capitalized on by steering customers towards longer duration of data storage requirements with additive data, where there is added margin on top of that data storage because it is optimized for search and analysis capabilities from said vendor. So as a result, you see customers really struggle with not only the kind of the garbage in, garbage out type of scenario that Christian, you brought up in the beginning, but also struggling with how to manage the costs associated with data retention for those particular compliance requirements. And there's a number of organizations that I've been working with recently actually have teams dedicated to now those costs, the acknowledgement that approach is no longer sustainable, and replicating and storing data a third or fourth time, specifically to meet compliance requirements and the added margin and cost associated with storing that data in that particular format is simply no longer sustainable or justifiable with the business requirements, which is driving a lot of customers towards this conversation about what does the next generation AI-powered SOC look like.
Yep.
Your comments, your thoughts?
Don, go ahead.
Yeah. So I guess the thing I'd add to it is the blind spots you have with traditional SIEMs, right? If you're not doing any kind of meaningful anomaly detection and behavioristic detection, a 0 day is going to hit you and you're not going to know it hit you until it's too late, right? But if a 0 day hits you and it's detected as an anomaly in kind of the new next generation SIEM, then you've got a shot at that, right? The other thing is there's so much data that's now encrypted at rest and in transit. How are SIEMs dealing with those encryption blind spots, right? So those are a couple of things that in the current world we live in are becoming more and more important than when the SIEMs were initially deployed and developed. And I could go on. There are many more of those kinds of things, but the next generation has to be able to deal with those kinds of threats because those are the ones that we're seeing now.
Yep. Yeah, and I think this is actually a great transition to what's next here in our presentation or our discussion. Many of these enterprises and forward-thinking organizations are trying to figure out what's next and what's the next generation. And over the past few years, NTA and NDR has become a hot topic within the industry and something that enterprises are starting to lean on to bring their organization into the next generation, right? But it hasn't all been necessarily roses when it comes to just implement these tools and everything will be great. Jeff, you actually, we spoke about this recently, but maybe you can talk a little bit about what some of the challenges that still exist when it comes to including these NTA and NDR tools if they're not outfitted with the correct, features like AI or specific types. What are some of the challenges that are coming across even when organizations are starting to bundle in these NTA and NDR tools?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's interesting. One of the organizations I was working with, I think, summed it up beautifully. They came to me and they said, "Can you please help us understand why I'm being told that I have to evaluate and implement 3 different platforms when my functional requirements are essentially the same?" And you have them well articulated here. I need improved security threat posture. I need improved visibility. I need to be able to search and investigate and dig into events. I need to be able to understand zero-day attacks and prevent those attacks, or even understand the footprints of a forthcoming attack and focus the attention of operators and security teams on events before exfiltration has occurred. And the question came up of why do I have to look at these three vendors? Isn't there something that provides a collective approach to meeting my functional requirements without the requirement to unintentionally build in latency into the system and unintentionally add costs and unintentionally add resources? And the answer, of course, is yes. I mean, the convergence of NTA and NDR and SIEM is fundamental to this idea of the next generation SOC. But one thing that's not reflected on this slide here is the additive complexity of what many vendors are referring to as ML or AI, the addition of off-the-shelf types of technologies that are kind of cobbled together to try and provide supplementary insights, or ideally reduce the dependency on the number of operational resources to run these systems. As Don so eloquently stated, there's these individuals that are running the SOC and NOC are highly trained, highly skilled, in high demand for their expertise. And to have those types of individuals combing through thousands of alerts every day to identify those that represent true threats and anomalies is simply unsustainable. The individuals that are tasked with that type of role are inevitably frustrated. Number one, it's a mundane and redundant role, and it's something that humans simply aren't good at. You're much better applying some type of artificial intelligence to do repetitive mundane tasks like comb through huge volumes of data and alerts to identify true threats and activities based on things like anomalies. And so I think it's really important to note that, again, the convergence of these things is not something that is being driven by a particular vendor or a particular business challenge. It is being driven by organizations that recognize that the functional requirements that they are tasked with should be able to be addressed by a single platform that provides all of this type of capability, that doesn't require me to replicate and aggregate and build latency into the system unnecessarily. And organizations now, you'll see a lot of vendors trying to respond to that. And you even see the analyst community responding to that. I thought it was very interesting when I started working closely with the industry analysts on this topic. They have a SIEM analyst, and they have an NDR analyst, and they have an XDR analyst, and they have an AI analyst. And those analysts are not collectively evaluating solutions. They are evaluating solutions in silos and independently. So I think it's also important to note the analyst community is starting to realize that this convergence is well underway, and they now have to take expertise from what were historically distinct categories and then bring them together to better address the needs of customers. Don, your thoughts and perspective?
Yeah, I agree. I agree with your assessment on this. I think where it starts and where we have the initial problem that applying AI and machine learning to this is just in creating the baseline. That's a really hard part to do. But if you don't get that right, then you're just going to continue to perpetuate those false positives all the time, right? Because you don't know what you're up against in terms of what you expect to see, and what you expect to see changes over time, as we know, especially now when organizations are operating so differently than they did 5 months ago, right? I mean, think about it. At the beginning of the year, people were largely in their office operating on their systems, right? And things were very predictable, maybe more predictable. But now you don't know where people are coming from, right? You don't know where they're sitting. You don't know what kind of device or network they're on, right? And how secure it is. This kind of thing keeps me up at night. So I think the SIMs need to adapt, and I guess that's the key in this next generation of SIM. it has to be able to adapt to changing habits, changing behavior. It has to be able to deal with the whole user entity behavior analytics piece. If it's not doing that, it's missing, the internal piece. It's missing a really robust baseline to deal with, right? And so I think all of those things then, feed into the need to get this more adaptive hybrid situation that we're living in today, where you're bringing the traffic and the events and under this rubric of NDR, of the network detection and response. I mean, that's really the general category under which NTA falls, right? And that is the key. And then having to work across internal organizations and teams to do that. That's a lot of the other heavy lifting that has to be done and understood.
I love what you said, and if I may just kind of pile on, you mentioned the initial effort that goes into establishment of a baseline. Historically, this idea that you need to aggregate, a month's to years worth of data for comparative analysis and compare events against that baseline. It's, I think, important to note, and you touched on it as well, that continuing to maintain that baseline over time is a non-trivial task. Foundationally, that approach is fundamentally flawed, and then it requires constant care, tuning, and maintenance from, again, highly trained, highly skilled data scientists and experts involved in understanding that data to continually refine that baseline. And fundamentally, my position is that is just unsustainable. This idea that you can move into a next generation SOC when you have an architecture that is based foundationally on a model that is designed for search and investigation against historical events is fundamentally flawed. You'll never get to where the functional requirements that you just described with an approach that's built on that legacy platform. A bold statement, I know, but Don, I would love your perspective on that.
Yeah, that's really what I was driving at, right? You have to take the human factor out of this as much as you can, because it's just too resource intensive. Yeah. So the question really on the table here, I think we need to address, and we can address on this call, is how it's self-perpetuating, right? How does it operate with the least amount of human intervention to give you the best outcomes and results, right? What do you have to do? And as you said, this is not trivial to develop. I think it'd be hard for internal teams to develop that capability. There are maybe very few providers that have been able to build this into their tools. And then to the extent that they have they done it in a way that is easy to consume and use? Yeah. What's the human interface to it, right?
That's spot on. And I think you guys are leading us down a great path, because I think we're going to get into just what that looks like. But before we do, I wanted just to tell a quick story. After going through this slide, earlier in this week, I was doing an exercise where I was looking through the Gartner and some of these other analyst definitions of what SIEM and NTA and NDR are, right? And I think sometimes we get confused, or we tend to put things into buckets. And as I was looking through these definitions and finding some similarities, I literally found the same 6-7 features on a SIEM, NTA, and NDR platform. They're almost, this in this day and age, the same sort of thing in many ways. And that's why I think we see this convergence of the functionality and the feature set. And, as we move on to a next generation SOC, I think, it's going to start with the tools that have the functionality that you guys are talking about here, that don't necessarily distract the team or make them less productive and efficient. And so I think maybe that starts with AI, right? And that moves us kind of perfectly into our next slide here. And Jeff, this is actually a quote of yours that I'll read. But I think the next generation SOC and the next generation SOC tool stack in particular starts with an AI first approach, right? And what you said was an AI first approach. What it means is improved operational efficiency, decreased resources spent on training, and increased management visibility into understanding what's happening with the network and its vulnerabilities, right? And so, Jeff, can you tell us a little bit more about what an AI first approach for this next generation SOC looks like, what it means, and what the implications are for security and security teams?
Sure. First, I will share my frustration with trying to dig in AI and ML first approaches to cybersecurity when I first started looking into this, because there was this it almost felt like there was an intentional propagation of this idea that business people couldn't possibly and would never be able to truly understand what an AI first approach means and how it operates. And I push back on that, as many of of the organizations we work with are pushing back. They will not tolerate this idea that there's a black box somewhere that is doing some behind the scenes type of work to give them an AI first or ML first approach. And when I started to dig into a lot of the vendors that are talking about an AI or ML first approach, what I found was that it was really nothing new. Almost generally across the board, each of these platforms would take historical subsets of data. They would apply basic clustering and labeling techniques to that data. They would manually build rules against those data clusters. And then they would have a team of operators that would continually train and tune the model throughout the deployment. And one large financial services organization I was working with, I think, summed it up beautifully. And they said, hey, if I'm bringing on an AI first approach to cybersecurity to reduce resources in my SOC, I don't want to have to more than make up for those resources by bringing on a whole bunch of ML and AI experts to continually tune and maintain this model. And to take that a step further, when we started looking at the practical applications of that approach, what you find is those systems fundamentally don't work if you turn rules off. They're exclusively based on human intelligence and known threats and behaviors and labeling. And what happens, unfortunately, is as many customers move in the next generation SOC to this requirement that they have visibility into and can identify low and slow attacks, zero-day attacks, and things like leading indicators of a forthcoming attack. What you find with that approach that these other vendors are touting as ML or AI is when you have behaviors that fall outside of the predefined rules or the predefined clusters or the predefined context of that underlying baseline, to Don's point, you end up with one of two results. You add to the false positive rate is one less than desirable end result. And an even worse result is those behaviors are ignored by the system because they're not violating any threshold, they're not violating any rule. It's an unseen or never before seen type of attack. So I think fundamentally, when we talk about an AI first approach, the first thing you have to do is take a good hard look at what people are calling AI. And I apply a couple of basic rules, which is, does the system require human operator involvement to create a baseline and to continually tune and operate the system, to label and cluster and train the foundational data? These are some questions that I would encourage people to ask of vendors that are touting themselves as AI. And one question that I think works extremely well to very clearly differentiate between leading AI vendors and other vendors that are calling cobbled together technology AI is ask how those systems behave when rules are turned off. Ask if there's no human operator involvement, and that will give you some perspective. And what you'll find is there's a very narrow group of true AI platforms on the market today that operate in a truly unsupervised manner, that truly decrease the number of human resources that are involved in the system, that can truly demonstrate improvements in operational efficiency by reducing false positives and focusing the attention of these very highly skilled operators on their true job function, which is focusing on true threats and anomalies, to act upon, respond to, and protect the organization from in the future. And a very verbose answer, but hopefully, as you can tell, I'm pretty passionate about this. Don, I want to give you plenty of time to respond as well.
Sure. So, Jeff, when my head's starting to spin when you're talking about this, because if you're when you're talking about an AI first, that approach, and building in, which you have to, the machine learning along with the AI, and then trying to get that into a large enterprise or even a medium-sized enterprise in an affordable way and quickly. My experience in the past with SIEMs is always, I have all this information, all these reports I've generated, all of these rules that I have in my current SIEM. And now if I'm going to go put something else in, I have to replicate those rules. I've got to generate those reports again. It's time consuming. It takes forever. And in the meantime, you're not getting the benefit from what you're trying to do with the next generation SIEM. So the reason I'm, my head is spinning is I'm thinking about how do you do that in a cost-effective manner, right? That organizations can afford, because they've invested a lot in their current platforms. Okay. And now is this a whole new investment on top of that? Do I have to wait to retire my old SIEM to put the next generation in? I mean, how do I justify that in the organization so I can get more quickly to this next generation and remove all the pain I'm experiencing now? That's the question I have for you, Jeff.
No, I think you absolutely nailed it, and great question. So the short answer is, in order to transition to a next generation SOC, the platforms that are selected to provide this functionality need to be complementary. Number one, they need to be complementary and non-disruptive to the existing environment. Secondly, you hit it right on the head. They need to be cost effective. Ideally, they need to be fully unsupervised and cost effective with the demonstrative ROI and demonstrative functional enhancements that allow organizations to, perhaps even in parallel for a few weeks or months, run the system simultaneously as they migrate from one to the other. So they're not losing any of the work, or they can leverage them to enhance existing systems in place by allowing those SIEM systems to operate more effectively without adding to the proliferation of data or the addition of data retention requirements. And so you bring up a very good point, and I think something that needs to be included in the competitive differentiation discussion as part of a transition to a next generation SOC is very specifically ask those questions of the vendors. How can this complement the existing investment I've made in other technologies? How can I maximize the investment in human intelligence that I've put a lot of resources into, including things like rules and intel feeds and advanced analytics? Can those play a supplementary and augmenting role to the platform? And the answer, quite simply, has to be yes. It has to be cost effective. It has to be complementary. Has to have clearly demonstrable functional and feature enhancements, and it needs to be able to operate in a way that business users, as well as these very technical users, can make sense of the information and act accordingly. Did I answer your question, Don?
Yeah, you did. So if I take that a step further, right, in this next generation SOC, right, and organizations have their network operations center. They're looking more at kind of the up down, right, or traffic overload and how they're dealing with that. And so when the NOC is getting that data, right, of course, in my experience, the first thing they do when they have an issue is we must be having a problem with one of our security tool deployments, right? Our filters aren't working right. Our antivirus is messed up. Something is causing us to have this problem. And hey, you security guys, what are you doing about it? And what is so in the next generation SOC, what I'd be looking for is I'm going to tell the NOC before they tell me, right?
Absolutely right.
Right. So that's where this, this convergence, right, with SIM and NTA, NDR come into play for me. I want to be able to be the one, as the CISO, not always in defensive reactive mode. I want to be the one saying, hey guys, I need you to look at this because, maybe we're looking at a ransomware attack because that server's pegged and it never has been before. Right. So that's, to me, kind of nirvana from a CISO perspective is I'm the one telling the organization what's happening and not having somebody come to me and ask me what we're doing that's causing the problem.
I love everything you said. Sounds like you and I have been in the same type of war rooms where everybody's pointing at one another, trying to figure out what the root cause is for things like an outage. But I will ask you one question to elaborate on that is, where do you see the role of the business teams as well in those discussions? Do you see, as part of the next generation SOC, do you see business professionals being part of this discussion in terms of the implications and responsiveness? And how does that the idea of a next generation SOC play into the idea that perhaps you have business as well as technical people involved in understanding both the nature of the threat as well as the implication?
What a great question, because what that leads to me is if every good risk assessment that you do inside an organization has to do one thing really well before you even talk about security risk and technical risks, right? In the infrastructure. And that is, what are the crown jewels of the organization? There is no one that understands what those crown jewels are better than business people. Don't go ask an IT person what's the most important information the company has. Ask the business leaders, right? And so if you're able to pull them into the conversation, then you not only have, if you're using AI, you not only have the artificial part, you have the business intelligence part, which is key, because why chase after things that the business doesn't consider important, right? The people to tell you what's important are the people on the business side. So if you have a way of converging them or bringing them in, and it doesn't have to be the leader, it has to be the person in the organization who deeply understands the operations of that business and where the data is and what data is important. What are we really trying to protect, right? Where's our IP? Right? How are we protecting that? Where's the information that's stored about M&As that are in process, right? That I can't let out, right?
Absolutely.
Where's my pricing strategy and my go-to-market strategy and all those things that are important to my business, right? And client data that we hold so dear that if it gets out, reputationally will cause us a problem, right? Because if you don't have that trust, then it starts with that. If you don't have that, your organization will fail. So I like the fact that you brought up that point, and I love the fact that we're bringing it up real time because we didn't talk about it before we had this conversation. Because to me that's really critical in helping an organization understand the threats and how they can be dealt with, and what's most important. Chase after the things that are important to the business, and set aside the things that aren't so important.
Yeah.
Very well said. Thanks, Don.
Yeah. And, in the interest of time and the riveting conversation, I want to continue on the next topic, which kind of is going to revolve around, okay, so we've talked about the problems with the old way, and we've talked about what you can do to get yourself ready for the next generation SOC. But let's talk about tools, and let's talk about what a real true next generation SOC needs in their tool shed and in their tool stack, and why that's what we would call real-time generative AI security. Okay, and the next two slides will kind of discuss some of the features and the things that we think are important there. But Jeff, why don't you kick that off and talk about why do security teams need this, and why is it different than the old way of doing things?
Yeah, thank you, Christian. It's a good question, and just to provide some context, for folks that may not be aware, there is a category of artificial intelligence platforms that is referred to as being generative. And really the idea of being generative fundamentally means that the AI is independently able to identify in context patterns and trends of behavior without historical data or human modified contextual models. And really what that means in terms of a practical application is two things. There needs to be a generative approach applied to the baseline, as Don referred to earlier. In an ideal world, you have an AI-informed baseline that understands those patterns of behavior in context and can adjust and modify its response as your network behavior, as your threat posture changes. And what we see with the historical approach is if you have a static baseline, as Don referred to earlier, if I have a historical static baseline that has been tuned and clustered and is foundationally based upon rules, any minor change to normal network behavior will signal a false positive. And those false positives will continue to be thrown up until the baseline and the rules with that baseline are modified to accommodate that change. So it's interesting because a lot of the vendors in the space ignore the manual intervention and the cost and time associated with addressing these types of things. And so a generative solution needs to be able to understand the context of behavior. If you add a new phone system, if you have people, as we've seen recently, that pivot from primarily a work office environment to a home office environment, those create dramatic changes in what would be considered a normal network traffic baseline that would represent a tremendous amount of manual work with a legacy approach to SIEM. So the generative component to the baseline is absolutely fundamental and a very distinguishing feature between what is defined by DARPA as third wave artificial intelligence platforms versus previous attempts. And if you take that a step further, the generative piece needs to be applied to the identification of in-context patterns of behavior as it relates to alerting and anomaly detection and things like zero-day or low and slow attacks. So inevitably, even if an adversary was to launch the same attack over and over again, a generative AI solution will be able to identify very subtle changes in the nature of that attack that will allow it to differentiate and surface that as an anomaly that differs every single time. And so being able to have a generative component that is applied to the baseline, as well as a generative component that is able to adapt and understand in context patterns of behavior, is foundational for identifying zero-day attacks, low and slow attacks. And perhaps most importantly, if we bring that back to this idea of decreasing a dependency on human operators, what this does is it allows the baseline to continue to evolve without human operator involvement. It provides for an accurate baseline that is independent of rules or thresholds that are manually defined. It allows the system to identify and correlate and prioritize true threats and differentiate them from false positives without human intervention. And last but certainly not least, it allows the system to focus the attention of the operator on meaningful attacks and anomalies rather than having them comb through hundreds, if not thousands, of false positives on a daily basis. With that, again, I've said a lot. Don, your perspective.
Yeah, I'm gonna bring up something that two of your leaders I know I've talked to ad nauseum about, John and Igor, because a lot of what we've been talking about so far is on the IT side, and we have to also be able to focus on events on the OT side, the operational technology side. In the space I operate in building technology and building automation systems, a lot of threats are coming through those systems, right? Which are very different than your traditional IT systems and often not managed by the IT team, and they're left, and because of that, they're largely left unmanaged. So now imagine that, in the property, in the guest Wi-Fi in the property that's hooked up to the corporate network inadvertently, or somebody who just plugs in a device into an open port that does connect to the corporate network, or those building systems aren't segmented properly. So this next generation SOC has to be able to take into account both the IT and the OT side,
right?
And have that focus. And I need to be able to know which one it is that's potentially under attack or misconfigured, right? Or highly vulnerable, because that can lead to a lot of other things, in terms of, once I get in, I'm in, and now I just start moving, right? So I don't want to leave that piece aside. I want to make sure it's understood that we have to take those into account too, especially if you're talking about your customers who have industrial control systems, or and any kind of OT. It really doesn't matter. There's no organization that doesn't have those in their space, and now they're going to have a lot more of them, because they're going to be these detectors, these health detectors, and scanning technologies in the properties. When people start going back, it's going to look a lot different. We have to be able to adapt to those, right? Yep. So this gets to this generative piece you just talked about.
Don, you bring up an interesting topic, and one that I think is worthy of some further discussion, and that is, many of the SIEM vendors, and I'm sure you're well aware, have started offering operational analytics premium packages as well, that are built foundationally on the same underlying technology that the SIEM platform is built. And you bring up an interesting point, I think, in that to accommodate the operational requirements, the traditional approach requires yet another layer of extraction, normalization, analysis, and rules from those third-party vendors to even create a foundation for search and investigate for operational issues. So again, it may be a new use case for traditional SIEM vendors, but the foundational approach is identical to legacy SIEM. Am I correct with that statement?
I think it is, but I think that it's not well understood, is how I leave that. With the traditional SIEM vendors, it's not well understood. It's not well understood by the IT teams and the security teams that are consuming this information. And so if it's left aside, it's what I spoke about earlier in terms of that expanding threat surface, right? It just keeps getting bigger and bigger. And you cannot ignore those operational technologies. They have to have some way to incorporate that in, and pull that data in a meaningful way and be able to report on it and identify it appropriately.
Yeah, well said.
All right, well, we're going to kick it to the last slide, and then we're going to get into Q&A. I did want to touch on one thing that you guys discussed earlier, and it was about the baseline. And Don, you brought this up as a former CISO, of CBRE, and you specifically said that, without a good baseline, there's nowhere to go from there, and you can't. The jumping off point needs to be a good baseline, right? And one of the things about a good baseline and what you do from there is a baseline that is what we call generative, what we were just talking about, that can update on its own over time without the needs for humans to constantly do it as well. So maybe you could kick this conversation off about, why is the baseline so important, first of all, but why is a generative baseline that uses something like self-supervised AI, a term that we just brought up, that allows, which means, self-updating or self-adapting AI. Why is a baseline using a technology like that so important?
Well, from my perspective, why it's important is because if you look at the controls in, say, the CIS, right, top 20 critical controls, you have to know what you have. You have to know your inventory. You have to know your hardware. You have to know your software. I mean, if you don't know what you have in your organization, that has to be your starting point, right? Right. And you need to understand the behavior of your company, and each company behaves differently. If I'm a global company, then my expectation is that my systems are getting hit at all times of day, 24 hours a day, right? So what's a weekend in the US is start of day in parts of the world, right? And so so I need to know where that traffic's coming from. I need to know what I expect to see of that traffic during those times, right? And so if I don't know that, I'm not going to be able to deal with the anomalies.
Yep.
So everything has to start with a good, solid baseline. And as we discussed earlier, it has to adapt with change. And there is change, and we're experiencing it right now. Wouldn't you say, Jeff?
Uh-oh, did we get Jeff? Jeff might be a little bit frozen here. Hopefully he comes back.
I hope I didn't do anything to freeze the poor
guy. No, I don't think you did the program, but Jeff may have just gone on a little break here. No, I think he's having a little bit of a technical issue here. So, until Jeff comes back on, I think what he
there you are.
You hear me now?
He's back. He's back, everyone.
Oh, great. I had my big one-liner ready, so I'll just think of it as a dramatic pause. What I will say is, and I think this is a very unique distinction. Without a generative baseline, you cannot have a self-supervised solution. And it's as simple as that. I will say there's a lot of vendors in the marketplace that have done a masterful job of trying to downplay the lack of having a generative baseline by referring to their solutions as semi-supervised or partially self-supervised. And really, again, when you take the time to look under the covers and understand what that means is there's a tremendous amount of initial work that goes into establishing a baseline that is immediately out of date the second the system goes into production, and will require constant care and feeding and tuning by machine learning and data science experts to be able to operate. And it's an important distinction, and one that I think customers need to be aware of as they're trying to evaluate and understand the solutions that they're bringing to market. What you will find is without a generative baseline, you're creating more work than you have today.
That's perfect, Jeff. Thank you so much for piling on with what Don said. And I think, we've had so many questions here in the chat and just question poll. So I think we want to go into the Q&A since we're about 1 hour and 2 minutes in now. We've got a lot of really great questions, so I'm sorry if I don't get to everyone in the interest of time. But I want to start with this one, and it came up in a couple of different forms throughout the webinar. And you guys spoke a little bit to it in one of the earlier slides. Is the question is, so how do you transition to a next generation SOC if you already have tools and processes in place? Like, I think that's a great question from the audience here. How do you begin that transition and then make that transition?
Well, I'll start with a requirement.
Okay.
Right? And then I'll look to Jeff to say how that requirement can be met, right? And this is what we talked about before. I want to be able to quickly deploy a new solution, and I hope we don't. Oh, we lost this video. Okay, I want to be able to quickly, deploy a new solution and have it operating. And I guess I don't know, Jeff, are you still with us, or did we lose you?
I am. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
we hear you. We just don't see you.
It's fine.
Okay. So I guess, Jeff, my question to you is, because you mentioned this earlier, right? Run it in parallel, and then over time, maybe you can decide what you can get rid of or you don't need anymore because it's not meaningful to you. But
Right.
How do you very quickly get operational in this kind of next generation generative baseline type of SOC tool?
Sure. I guess I'll say, first and foremost, organizations aren't coming to us with a perspective that their SIEM deployments are meeting their functional and budgetary requirements today. Across the board, our customers are coming to us saying, we are we are spending a tremendous amount of money and a tremendous amount of resources and not getting what we expect out of the system. And it's what Christian referred to earlier today, which is the ability to have demonstrable ability to improve, to show improved security threat posture, ability to identify zero-day attacks, the ability to demonstrate a decrease in mean time to resolution, the ability to demonstrate that costs and resources can be managed while those functional requirements are addressed. So the vast majority of the customers that come our way are coming to us because they are dissatisfied or have exceeded their budgetary requirements with their current deployment. So we have to be mindful of that in the first place. And what we always say is, if you don't see significant business benefits from a next generation AI informed self-supervised SOC in a week or two, keep looking. Because truly, and we have customer references. We had one recently where they had a full legacy SIEM deployment and a full user behavior analytics deployment. So they were looking at them independently for north, south, and east-west types of traffic analysis. And they came to us and they told us that they were able to see, to get greater functional value, have greater visibility into operational inefficiencies, and improve security threat posture in a week with a third wave AI system, mixed mode in particular, than they were able to accomplish with over 2 years of previous deployments. Now, in this particular example, it's not a rip and replace type of scenario. It's, can one augment the other for now? And then they will do a phased expansion of one and a phasing out of the other in a way that allows them to still meet their budgetary requirements. So I think the answer, sadly, is it depends. But one of the things I will go back to saying is a next generation SOC platform needs to be complementary. It cannot be disruptive. It cannot require a rip and replace. It needs to be able to operate in parallel with demonstrative results that show that you can get more out of the system with fewer resources and less cost in order for it to be fully adopted in production. Don, anything I said you disagree with or want to challenge?
No, I don't disagree. I actually think if you're able to demonstrate that you could get this up and running within a week, I don't think there'd be a CISO anywhere that wouldn't say, I need that. And so that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is if it's now not just a SIM, right? But remember, I have these other tools that are telling me what's going on in my network, right? So if it's coming in and giving me not just what a traditional SIM gives me, but also analyzing my network traffic, and with the convergence, and that's one of the questions in here. Now you've not only given me better information than I have today that I'm very frustrated with, you're giving me a wider swath of information than I was able to get before, that I'm getting from multiple tools, right?
Absolutely.
That's great. So we're at 12:08, so I want to just do one more question because I'm sorry, we had such a great discussion. We weren't able to get to all the questions, but this one came up in a couple different forms, and I'll just read it verbatim here. One of the biggest challenges my SOC faces is an overload of alerts, and most of them are false positives. How do, quote, next generation SOC tools handle this type of problem? Does either of you want to kick off?
Jeff.
Yeah, I'd be happy to take that, Don. So it's really important, I think, when we talk about a next generation SOC, that we understand that there's a number of different components, and we've touched on some of them today. But the system should be independently able to identify the difference between a rules violation and a true threat or anomaly. And the way that third wave AI systems should operate, or the way that the next generation SOC should operate, is you should start with an AI informed perspective that includes anomaly detection, threat detection, intel events detection, all of the things that you would expect, and be independently able to correlate and identify patterns of behavior that represent true threats and anomalies at that as a starting point, and surface those to the operator first. The system should also be able to go down a level and be able to show you exactly what you would expect with a traditional rules-based system. So again, this idea that, as you look at vendors in the marketplace, you'll see this. Many of them operate as a black box, and they say, well, we're going to show you what we show you, and you either believe it or you don't. In order for a true next generation SOC to be able to operate, those business savvy, technical, highly trained individuals that are operating in the SOC or the NOC typically want to see the layers of granularity. So they want to be able to see the AI-informed aggregation and prioritization of all of the factors that contribute to alert, and drill into that to show an AI-informed perspective on correlation of just a rules-based approach, and then be able to drill down further and show just kind of violation of rules and thresholds and intel feeds, and drill even further and give you search and investigate into full packet inspection for search and investigative analysis, and drill even further. So as I said, that operates as a black box. It needs to provide full transparency and full granularity that you would expect from a legacy system, and then some. And that's I think really an important function, is that you need to look for a solution that provides additive level of detail, inclusive of AI-informed insights, inclusive of suppression of false positives, demonstrable examples of the system to be independently able to focus the attention of the operators on true threats and anomalies, and still give the drill through level of granularity you would expect to conduct full forensic deep packet inspection types of analysis. Did I answer that question effectively? And Don, is there anything else you would like to add?
No, I think you hit it spot on, and I so I think that's really where the rubber's going to meet the road on this, is how we approach this in a more in a broader way, right? And so yeah, that was perfect.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we had quite a few good pieces of discussion here, and you guys, thank you so much for being on the panel discussion here today and giving us all this knowledge. There's one last thing I wanted to do before we kind of break. We recently wrote a white paper guide about this, specifically the next generation SOC and the type of tool stack that you want to be using in a next generation SOC. So everyone that attended the webinar, signed up for the webinar, will be sending this out via email. So check out, make sure to keep an eye out for that. And thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you, Don, and thank you, Jeff, so much for being a part of this panel discussion. And if you guys have any questions, concerns, thoughts, feel free to email us or go to our websites, 5qcyber.com or mixmode.ai to reach out to us. And I think that's going to be all for today. Thank you again, Don and Jeff, and I really appreciate the discussion.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Christian.
You guys, it's been a lot of fun and a true pleasure. I really appreciate the discussion, and for the audience, feel free to reach out via LinkedIn as well. I certainly welcome this type of discussion and any additional perspective you want to share. We'd love to hear it.
That's
thank you all. Really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks,
Take
guys.
care, everybody.
Talk
Be safe.
Bye-bye.